So, in conclusion of the arguments on environment, I urge you that first, you should deny this application for conditional use. If you find in your hearts and in your evaluation that you will issue a conditional use permit, I beg you to attach to it a condition of a determination of wetland, and also attach to it a determination of environmental impact all the way through into the western boundary of our fair city. Now to the economic argument. The economic argument has to do with property tax, and you've heard this argument before, I'm sure. I have every confidence in our city's ordinances and in our city's laws and regulations with regards to subdivision, roads, and various things of that nature, that infrastructure can addressing stormwater discharge and also addressing potable water and sewage discharge are very adequate. We've done a good job in our city to create those laws, and they're good ones. And there's nothing wrong in this particular site, in my view. My argument is off-site because the Logos School has sought and continues to seek protection each year under Idaho Code 63602 sub B, relief from property taxes that's afforded to churches, educational institutions, and so on. So property tax that would normally be associated with an R2 subdivision, as an example, are forfeit to the city through the process of collecting property taxes to the county. And as you know, if you've worked with the city government, the majority of our general fund comes from the fair share of property taxes from Latah County. Even though the infrastructure may be met on property, off property, considering the location of this property, is that it requires an increased head, which is pressure from either a tank or from pumps to create water pressure to serve this facility. Living adjacent to it, at the very end of Concord Street, I can tell you personally that during heavy use times, especially in summer months, the water pressure decreases significantly in that neighborhood. And if the water mains there are going to be simply attached and without further development on the head side, then we will not have significant pressure. That burden falls upon the general fund of our fair city. The second part of that, that's potable water. The second part of that is sewer discharge. Regarding its lowest location and the proposed area of the bridge, which is probably, I'm thinking, one of the lowest areas in the corner of that property. If there's sewer being discharged there, it has to cross Paradise Creek. If sewer is being discharged on the north side, it still has to cross Paradise Creek, and God forbid we cross Paradise Creek on top. And so that means that effluent must be pumped. We're talking about lift stations. We're talking about pumping stations to get effluent off property. Once it's off property, it's the responsibility of our city again. And there, I think that additional muscle to move the effluent would be required at the city's expense, and I think that's unfair. Finally, I'm coming to a conclusion here. As said earlier, a 100-year floodplain, by definition, is a flood event that has a 1% probability of occurring in any given year. The 100-year flood is also sometimes referred to as a 1% flood. But you might wonder, why do we keep such records? Well, the reason is that it provides a basis for flood insurance rates. And on average nationwide, 100-year flood estimates are sufficient for the purposes of the National Flood Insurance Program, and they offer reasonable estimates for future flood risk. However, a floodplain designation is reactive, not proactive. The U.S. Geological Survey and others, now FEMA, I understand, is involved in creating the data. I have no idea, since I retired, how often the data is collected, but data is periodically collected and the floodplain is adjusted according to the data. I propose to you that the floodplain of Paradise Creek will increase as a result of building such a facility on this site. And as it increases, those who lend for mortgages, those who live already along Ford Street, adjacent to Paradise Creek, who pay flood insurance, people across the street, as an example, from which would be the west side of Ford Street, may very well be required as a condition of their financing to provide flood insurance. Finally, in the year 2005, the Moscow School District proposed a bond levy election to our citizens and brought before the voters in April of 2005 this levy to fund a proposal for a new high school campus on the northeast edge of the city, the exact property location we are now discussing. I'll say it again. It is the exact property location that we are now discussing. The levy needed 2/3 majority to pass, but it was soundly defeated with only 44% of the citizens of our city in favor. Now, near 60% of the citizens of Moscow voted against that levy, not because they're opposed to education. As you know, we have one of the better education systems around, and this is like the best in the state of Idaho. People come to Moscow, Idaho, to raise their children here because of the educational opportunities afforded by our school district, and also people come here for the educational opportunities afforded to them by Logos School, which in its particular category of education is rated very high. So the question is not about education. The question is not about Gothic. The question is not about height, which I might compliment you on your design. I think it's wonderful. I think it's beautiful to see the Gothic buildings like that. The question is that it was a bad plan then. It's a bad plan now. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comments. Other comments against this project? Is there anyone else who would like to speak? Well, the hour is late, and a number of questions have been raised by Mr. Driver's comments in particular. Becky, in terms of answering some of those questions, are you in a position to do that tonight or not?
You're talking about his questions?
Yes.
I am not in a position to respond to those questions.
Okay.
No.
Would it be, in terms of conducting this meeting, if we held off, if we closed the hearing and reopened the hearing at our next meeting, would we be able to have staff here who could address those
I
questions?
think that we could certainly do that.
Madam Chair, what particular questions are you concerned about?
Question from, yes, go ahead.
What particular, I mean, what are the concerns that you have that you think
Oh,
we need?
the concerns of the question about the ability of the city to impose a request for an environmental impact statement, as Mr. Driver suggested, for the water and wetlands impact of this development, the economic impact that he has raised, those kinds of questions.
Well, we can't
general,
impose an environmental
let me
impact
finish. I beg your pardon?
We don't have any authority to impose an environmental impact study.
Well, it's very interesting. We might.
Okay.
We might have that authority. Whether we have it, under under NEPA, I doubt, but we might have that ability otherwise. Mr. Becker, you had your hand up for a moment.
Is there an opportunity for rebuttal? If I can answer almost all.
I haven't, well, you could certainly try, but I think that that it might be preferable to refer this to a later meeting so that we could address that with staff here as well. Now, the other questions that were brought up had to do with economic impacts as well, and flood insurance, property taxes, and similar things. We can go ahead and do the rebuttal right now, but I believe if we do the rebuttal, then we have to close the hearing. Is that correct?
I do not know. I would have to look up public meeting law to confirm that. I don't know if Jerry knows.
Okay, well then, we'll at least take rebuttal, and then we'll consider where we go from there. Mr. Becker, anyone who wishes to rebut, and Mr. Becker's first.
Yeah, Scott Becker, Hodge & Associates, 405 South Washington. I'd just like to go down the list as they were presented, and I think I can answer almost all of your questions through that. F Street being congested as a possible drop-off site. I've discussed that with staff because that was brought up at other meetings, and talking to the engineering department, they said they would keep an eye on the uses of F Street, and if it became an issue, they would address it at that time. Right now, Mountain View is intended to be an arterial street with minimum stop sign, stop opportunities or four-way stops. So they are really at this point dead set against stoppage at F Street. So that is one that staff is going to keep an eye on and address. They've also applied for a Tiger grant to improve Mountain View. I know it's been in the paper, but that would improve it all the way from 8th Street through to where our project is also. The dog park, we understand the dog park is there, and the school is fine with that. There's a fence right now that goes along Mountain View Park on the east side that kind of contains the dogs, and we'd prefer to see that still left in place, just for protection of the students. Ultimately, student protection is the most important thing to the school and we believe to the community. I agree with Tony about the impact of additional impervious surface, and that just lends to another argument as to why we should minimize the footprint of the school and go a little bit higher. Instead of going one level with the school, if we can do 2 levels, then we minimize that footprint and we minimize the runoff. And the reason that we have retention ponds on the plan versus detention ponds, detention pond is designed to release the water at the same rate that it does prior to construction, so that we do not increase the floodplain, that it does not have an impact on the floodplain. However, in this instance, with the exception of the track and field, the rest of the open space is intended to be, very heavily, utilized for plants and green space. And we would like to water that with, we would like to capture the water that runs off and reuse that so that it doesn't actually even get into Paradise Creek, that we contain it and that we reuse it to water the landscape and beautify that way. Another thing is right now, this is a farm field. It gets tilled up every year. Every spring, you have runoff that comes right down through the middle of the site. You can see it on the right-hand side of the school. That's a drainage. All that water runs off. It carries sediment with it and runs right into Paradise Creek. If we can stabilize the whole site, then we're going to minimize any sediment transport in that area. And so once again, that just kind of lends itself to how I think we've kind of planned to make this site work and minimize those impacts and actually improve Paradise Creek rather than detract from it. We have done a wetland study, and there are some areas of wetland within the site. Those areas will be mitigated. We have additional site that we can do mitigation. We're working with a professional to work on that.
Is there anything more that you would like to tell us?
Jeff?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
I'll get to you in a minute.
Okay. As we get into the tax implications, granted they are, they are granted that tax-free status, but every homeowner that sends their kids to this school is paying for the other school, but also paying for this school. So they're still paying taxes. It draws more people into the community and it increases that tax base. So I don't believe that the city takes a negative hit because of that. All the infrastructure that you see here tonight, that's all put in by this development and not at the city's expense. We tie into city utilities, but it's not at the city's expense. The water line, we anticipate that improving water throughout that area because we're going to loop the system. So versus having less water pressure, we're going to be able to increase the water pressure by running a larger line up the arterial and through that area. So those were the points I really wanted to touch on to address your concerns.
Okay, and one further thing that you didn't quite directly address, the question of the development of Mountain View and the toward the site and the bike paths and sidewalks and the rest of that.
Right.
What responsibility is this developer going to have for that?
They're going to have the responsibility to widen Mountain View. We're also working with the Public Works Department to whether we put in a bike path or a sidewalk, probably a bike path at this time on the north side of Mountain View. It wouldn't be on both sides, but it would be on one side. So we are.
What about sidewalks?
Well, that would be it would be the path or a sidewalk. That's the discussion. What is best for future plans of Mountain View? I know at some point is 28 feet the width they're really targeting? Are they going to just put it in and rip it out? We want to kind of plan ahead and work with Public Works to get that correct.
Okay, Mr. Long, you had a question.
You referred to wetland studies you've done. So have you determined whether there are any jurisdictional wetlands on the property? Or you're speaking wetlands like in a just generic sense?
No, there's specific wetlands sites on there. They're emergent wetlands.
Right, but there are none that would be characterized as jurisdictional wetlands
No.
subject to federal. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, any further questions? Any other rebuttal testimony? Thank you, Mr.
Actually, I
Becker.
do have one additional question, if that's okay,
Oh.
please. And I don't know if you're necessarily the person to answer this, or we can ask Becky, but so as part of your development, you will build this new road, and it will end at your property boundary.
Correct.
And then any subsequent continuation of the minor arterial down to D would be the responsibility of the neighboring property owner whenever that's developed.
That's correct.
So at the end of your project, effectively the public right-of-way will end at your...
Right. We can't dedicate somebody else's property.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further rebuttal testimony?